Seminary is 7 years long, and during my 5th year of seminary, at some point I went to a grocery store downtown, and I was wearing my Roman collar, and I decided to tab out, is what we call it. Took the tab out, left it in the car, hoping no one would recognize me as a seminarian. And, I just kind of look like a waiter if I'm just in straight black. And so I'm kind of buzzing through the store, grabbing real quick what I need, and at one point, I get to the end of an aisle, and a woman stops me, and she says, "Excuse me, are you a priest or something?" They always ask it exactly like that, priest or something. And so I said, or something, yes. And she was angry. And she started off with very aggressive questions on where is celibacy in the Bible. Okay, so now I'm doing what I can on the fly at the end of the chip aisle to have a theological conversation about celibacy, and she keeps interrupting me, and at a certain point she starts talking about the priest abuse scandal and how celibacy has been the cause of the abuse of children. And that's when I realized that she's had kids with her, and she's been keeping them away from me. She was purposefully standing in between me and the kids, as if I was somehow threatening her children there. It was a very uncomfortable conversation. I think it ended well enough, but for the next several days, I just found myself replaying that conversation over and over. And in my prayer, I was really asking the Lord, asking myself, do I really want to do this? I mean, at that point, I was convinced that I'm called to celibacy. I was convinced that I'm called to be a priest. But I'm not sure I wanted it. Like, if that's the kind of encounter I have when I'm not even really in my collar, what's it going to be like when I put on my collar? It made me nervous about going in public. What are the conversations I'm going to have? How many awkward conversations in the grocery store am I going to have with angry people who want to bring up some aggressive questions or bring up scandal or accusations? It really made me nervous about what could be. And yeah, those conversations have happened over the years. But as I prayed with it over those days, I guess you could say I ultimately came to the same conclusion that St. Peter had at the end of that gospel. Peter says, "Master, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life." I was convinced ultimately that the Lord wanted me to be a priest. It was just my own nervousness kind of getting in the way. I'm not sure I wanted to deal with whatever was going to come with that. And I knew that I needed courage. But in the end, I just want to do what he wants. I just want to be where he is. And if that means he's going to draw me into some really uncomfortable conversations, ultimately, I needed to pray for the courage to do that, because that's the only place where I want to be, is where Jesus is. It was good for me to kind of come to that realization. I think I also, in the midst of that, realized that even if I wasn't to become a priest, I'd still find myself in awkward conversations with sometimes angry people about the faith. You guys have all been there, probably. If we're going to be Christian in this world, a world that is increasingly secular and sees no place for religion, we're going to find ourselves having awkward conversations in awkward places with people who are sometimes angry. And we're going to have to defend why it is that we believe what we believe, why it is that we are the way that we are. And we might even be struggling with certain things of what Christianity is or what the church teaches. It's okay if we struggle with it, if we wrestle with it. Do we know Jesus? That's what it ultimately comes down to. In this gospel, we've been reading John chapter 6 now for several weeks. It's a very Eucharistic chapter of the Gospels. It's not the Last Supper, but Jesus is talking about the importance of eating his body and drinking his blood. And if we don't eat his body and we don't drink his blood, we don't have life within us. And we might have other Christian brothers and sisters to say that Jesus is all being symbolic there, but the plain and simple meaning is that Jesus really meant it. We have to eat his body and drink his blood. And it all comes to light at the Last Supper when he takes bread and says, "This is my body." He takes wine, he says, "This is my blood." We just take him at his word. We're not going to do mental gymnastics to try to figure out how this might be a symbol. We're just going to take him at his word. And it takes faith. It's hard, I realize, to grasp that. In today's gospel, we watch people walk away from Jesus because of this. His own disciples who had been following him, many of his disciples returned to their former way of life, and they no longer accompanied him. Over this whole issue, they found it uncomfortable. And it's not that they didn't understand. It seems that they understood it perfectly, because Jesus didn't back down and say, "Hey, you guys misunderstood." He let them walk away. And then he turned to the 12 and says, "Do you also want to leave me?" You can almost hear in Jesus' voice like that longing for them to say, no, we want to stay. You can hear the sadness in him. Do you also want to leave? We may find ourselves at times struggling with the reality of Jesus in the Eucharist. We might struggle with other things about being Christian, other things that Jesus has to say in the Gospels about maybe forgiving our enemies, loving those who hurt us. We might struggle with certain aspects of Catholic teaching, which would be Jesus' teaching through the church. Maybe any of the moral teachings of the church when it comes to sexuality or marriage or life issues. Maybe we struggle with these things. But the Lord's asking us, do you also want to leave? In a way, he's demanding them to make a choice. Either walk away like those guys did or stay fully with me. He's kind of demanding a choice from them. It was a similar thing from the first reading. Joshua was insisting that the people pick a side. Are you going to be a follower of God or are you going to go follow the false gods? But don't say that you're a follower of God and go do something else. Don't say you're a follower of God and live a different way. The Lord wants us to choose him. He doesn't want us to be hypocrites, even though we all stand in line for confession. Ultimately, we're all, in some little way, a hypocrite, right? He's inviting us to integrity. He's inviting us to choose him. Even if we don't always understand it, even if we struggle to agree with our personal opinions or what our political party has to say, even when we're struggling, the Lord wants us to choose him, to choose the church that he's established. So today in this Eucharist, yeah, he's done something scandalous. He's giving us his body and blood, and he's inviting us to choose him again. And as we come forward and we receive communion, as we're drawn into union with the Lord today, we pray for courage that when the day comes and we have to stand up for our faith, that we would say that we follow him because we recognize that there's nowhere else that we could possibly go.